married to Pam, has 3 grown children, and this month, 2 weeks ago, became a grandpa.
Congratulations.
And that's why Pam isn't with us, because she's with the new grandson. By profession, Ron is a structural engineer. He retired in 2012. He's been a member of Queen City Yacht Club for over 50 years. And he was Commodore of the club in 2015 and 16. And because he can't give up the job, he's Commodore again. Ron began sailing at QCYC Junior Club. He then sailed and raced in his dad's 6-meter International 14s, then Sharks. At the age of 60, he bought a boat he first admired at age 25, a CNC designed Viking 34. He has a lifetime of sailing highlights, including a transatlantic crossing in 2007, sailing to the Antarctica in 2008, and he spoke to us about that, crewing on replica 1906 Thomas Mill designed 12-meter in the Antigua Classic yacht race in 2014, and sailing 6-meter worlds in his dad's old boat in 2017, and he talked to us about that. We welcome Ron for the 3rd time then. And so, as you also may know, Ron's twin brother is Rob. So today, Ron is going to be speaking about cruising on the Mekong River, and which is quite a timely presentation given what's happening there today, and he's going to talk a little bit about that. So please give Ron a nice, warm Shellback welcome.
Thank you, Diane, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for showing up for this today. I'm just going to put this down somewhere. And just to clarify, Diane's already said it, I'm going to tell you again who I'm not. I'm not Rob. Rob's the well-known Canadian naval architect and now naval historian. I'm his twin brother, Ron, who Rob described as the guy who actually had a real job as a structural engineer. As Diane mentioned, Pam was supposed to be here today, but we had an event happen 2 weeks ago that interrupted that.
What would that be? There we are.
I'm doing something I swear I would never subject my friends and associates and total strangers to. All my life I've had crusty old bugger friends who became grandparents and became marshmallows and would show everybody the pictures of their grandchildren, and I was just not interested. And in fact, we declared our dining room a grandchild photo free zone. But I can't resist, so that's Liam, who arrived 2 weeks ago with all of
Better looking than you are.
But what today, I hope so. But what today's talk is about is a group of Queen City members who call themselves the Peckerhead Cruising Club.
With good reason.
For reasons I won't go into. Travel together on a regular basis, and there's about 7 couples involved, and we've gone to Italy and went to villas and Ireland and Europe. And so 2 couples had an idea we should go to Asia, because none of us had ever been to Asia before. And so they thought a cruise down the Mekong would be a good idea. And so they sent that out to the group, not expecting a lot of interest, but everybody signed up for it. So I'm going to try to find my pointer, which I seem to have lost. Here it is. So where we're talking about in the world is Southeast Asia. And I have to confess, my knowledge of geography in Southeast Asia before this trip was a bit shaky. So I wasn't quite sure where Cambodia and Vietnam actually were, despite growing up during the Vietnam War. But the area in question is here: Cambodia, Vietnam, and China, and it's not Burma anymore, it's Myanmar. But that's the general area we're talking about. And we're talking about the Mekong River, so I thought cruising down the Mekong would be fabulous. It's the largest river in Southeast Asia. It runs through about 5 different countries. It it comes down through China, then it becomes the border between Myanmar and Thailand, and it goes into Laos, and it becomes the border between Thailand and Laos, and it goes down into Cambodia, and eventually into Vietnam. So I'm thinking, boy, that's going to be some cruise. The cruise actually we took was just down here. Which was still pretty interesting. So here's the Mekong coming down. Here's Cambodia, and we started here in Siem Reap. And the cruise went from Siem Reap through Tonle Sap Lake, down the Tonle Sap River, into Phnom Penh, and there, and we haven't reached the Mekong yet. Here's the Mekong, and then we went up the Mekong a bit and down to Vietnam, and then cut through a canal into Ho Chi Minh City, which is here, which is Saigon, and still called Saigon by most of the people that still live there. So that was about a 13-day trip, about a week on the boat, and 3 days in Siem Reap, and 3 days in Saigon at the end. So the talk originally was entitled Hanoi, but I thought this being a sailing group, a trip down the river might be more interesting than a landlocked trip. So I'm going to show you gazillion slides of watercraft on the Mekong Delta. So the trip started in Siem Reap, Cambodia, which is really Angkor Wat. But I'm going to show you this slide. This is flying into Siem Reap, and I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It was land that was completely flooded for as far as the eye could see. And only later did I realize what we were actually looking at. And so I'll explain that as this talk goes on. This is Siem Reap. I would not recommend anybody travel halfway around the world to go to Siem Reap alone. It's simply a Southeast Asia town, and it's not particularly interesting on its own. You go to Siem Reap because that's how you get to Angkor Wat. And Angkor Wat is amazing and becoming very touristy. Just show you these wires. This is what you see in all Southeast Asian cities. Is what we heard was whenever someone needs a new power supply, they can't figure out what the existing wiring does, so they simply run a new line. Angkor Wat is a temple complex in northern Cambodia that dates from about the 9th to the 13th century. It was originally Hindu, then became Buddhist. It was never completely abandoned, but in the 1840s, the French, because this whole area was a French colony, it was Indochina, and the French rediscovered it in 1840, and it became a tourist attraction even then. So this is a poster from the 19th century that the French used for tourism. And I'm sure you've all seen images of. This is one of the main temples. It's actually a 400-acre complex with about at least a half dozen different temples built at different times, and they're quite remarkable. And some of them have been used in movies. I think one of the Raiders of the Lost Ark was done there. And it's become a major tourist attraction. But so we spent 3 days doing that, which was sort of a nice start to the trip. And then we joined the trip. And the trip, as I mentioned, goes on Tonle Sap Lake. The points there is an ecosystem threatened and life on the water. And we've been learning how to deal with high water here in Toronto in recent years. These people have been dealing with high water for 1,000 years, and they have completely adapted to it. Here's Tonle Sap Lake. It is two lakes. It is a high water lake that floods once a year to that light blue area, and then it shrinks to the dark blue area. And what's happening is the Mekong River, which comes in here, in the April monsoons, floods with water. The water pours down the Mekong from way up there in China and backs up in the Tonle Sap River. So the Tonle Sap River for half the year flows north and fills this entire area with water. And then when the monsoons stop, the level of the Mekong goes down. The elevation is such that the river flows south and empties that lake. And that has happened for twice a year for at least 1,000 years. And the fish stocks in the Mekong, it's considered a UNESCO biosphere site because it's referred to as a hot spot for biodiversity. And the reason Angkor Wat was so successful is that the fish in Tonle Sap Lake provided these resources to sustain that Khmer Empire even back then. In recent years, what's happened is all the 5 countries on the Mekong are short of power. They're all developing at a great rate. They're viewing the Mekong now as a source of hydroelectricity. So they're building dams.
Ooh.
Now this is a dam. This is off the internet. I didn't see it, but this is one of the dams on the Mekong in China. The world's largest arch dam exists on the Mekong River. It's higher than the Eiffel Tower. There are 20 dams either built or planned along the Mekong. So this is the Mekong. There's Tonle Sap Lake. So what's happening is the natural flow of water isn't occurring in the same way it used to. Fish stocks aren't migrating up and down. So Tonle Sap Lake is actually shrinking. And the tour boat we're on does that trip during the high water year, but it's coming to the point where it can't do that trip anymore because the lake is getting so shallow. And people who are dependent on that fishery are stressed now, and so what's happening is they're overfishing the reduced amount of fish that are there, and so they're getting concerns about extinction of some species, especially the giant catfish. So it's becoming a real ecological concern, none of which we learned on the boat trip because they want you to have a good time. But I've learned that since the boat trip, actually doing some of this research for this talk.
So the difference between the black and the red up there? The names of the dams?
Between dams that have been built and dams that are going to be built.
So the black have been built?
I expect the red are planned, the blue, the dark ones are completed, and the brown ones are under construction. Now, the reason they're doing this is, as I said, the area is desperate for power. Cambodia is now essentially operating off diesel generators for power, and so they thought this was an economically good idea. They're starting to realize that it may not have been such a good idea because of the huge environmental impact it's having, and the impact it's having on so many people's lives. Because most of the people fishing on the Tonle Sap and the Mekong River aren't truly commercial fishermen. They're sustainable. They're fishing for themselves. They're feeding their families, getting a little bit of extra fish to sell at markets to help sustain themselves. So it's not large commercial operations, but a huge amount of the population is dependent on it. After Angkor Wat, we got on a little ferry that took us through that river into Tonle Sap Lake, and so we got the first glimpse of what life on the water is like. This is what is on the charts or the maps we had called the Vietnam Village. Still haven't figured out why it's called the Vietnam Village on it, but I assume it's Vietnamese have come up into Cambodia and settled in this area. But it was typical for most of the Mekong. These are floating houses with boats out front. So as the water rises, they just move up and down with it. And they fish. The local commerce is done on local boats that simply go up and down. And these are just views along between Siem Reap and the lake, that little bit of water. Give an idea of what people, maybe this is what Toronto Island's gonna look like in a few years. And then we got to the end, and waiting out there was our cruise boat, which was called the Siem Reap, run by Avalon Cruise. And that's a closer look at it. It's 2 levels high. And we disembarked onto it. And this is pretty well the layout of it. It was small, and I think the Peckerhead group, I think there were 7 couples, so we got a good chunk of the boat. Our cabin was down here. So it's 2 levels, very shallow draft. There's a dining room here, upper level cabins, an indoor lounge and an outdoor lounge. And then the lower level is primarily cabins. This is the wheelhouses here, and the engine rooms are here, and staff accommodation. It was not roughing it by any means. This is our bedroom. That's Pam. That's not a full balcony, but the window's open. The full rail. That's the bow outside area. That's the lounge inside. So it was a nice size. We constituted about 30% of the passengers. The dining room. And that is on the bow looking out on the Tonle Sap Lake. When flooded, Tonle Sap is almost the same size as Lake Ontario. It's the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia. And the boat, when it came to shore, didn't have to find docking facilities. It just nudged to the shore, and we got out, which is a very nice way to do it. But this is an adaptation to life on the water. The water level is starting to go down now, and so everything is built on stilts. These ferries were almost identical all the way up the river. They're very simple technology, and they run back and forth. It's a gangplank and a barge. And people just get on and off. They load one end only. And the engine room is, this is probably an old car engine with a long shaft. And the fellow just stands by it and operates it quite easily. And that's a technology that's used on virtually all watercraft that we saw, except the larger turbos. And one thing I should mention is there's very little recreational boating on the Mekong. This is a farmhouse beside the Tonle Sap Lake. Everything's built up on sticks to allow for possible flooding. So everything has been adapted to the changing rivers. There's the landscape. The water is starting to go down, but it still is flooded everywhere. And they're starting to, as the water recedes, start planting as the water goes away. And again, the stairs on the left, they simply extend as the water goes down and rebuild each time. And so we're now leaving the lake and getting into this river system. And these boats are everywhere. You'll see a lot of pictures of them. And what they are is individual families who I suspect live on the boats for a good part of the time, or dock them very close to where they live. They usually consist of a man and a woman, presumably husband and wife, and an engine and 2 panels and a fish net. And so these are people who are fishing for themselves and selling a little bit to local markets. There's lots of development taking place in Cambodia. Cambodia's had, I'm sure as you're aware, a very troubled history in the last 50 years. There's lots of foreign investment. China is investing heavily in Cambodia and in fact wants to build a seaport on the Cambodian coast as part of their Belt and Bridge project. There's lots of concern about the influence China is going to have in all these Southeast Asian countries by essentially driving them into debt with the construction. These are things we saw in the river, and I'm still not quite sure what they are. I think they're fishing nets that are anchored in the river with cables. And we saw a number of them. So fishing is by far the biggest industry on the lake. There's another set, and another set. And again, we saw these everywhere. They have the engine on the long shaft, a shelter, and a fish net. They're essentially identical. Another bridge across the river. And housing, as you get away from the river, the housing gets more substantial because it can actually be above the flood level. But typically along the shore, you get floating houses and you get stilt houses as you go up the river. So as I say, this is a culture that has adapted to flooding. And the fish boats varied in size. This is one of the smaller ones we saw. The net systems varied, but they were all very small scale. But we all viewed it from the comfort of our boat. And as we got closer to Phnom Penh, the landscape changed from completely rural to more urban. So Phnom Penh, I mentioned a troubled history. Cambodia was part of Indochina until about 1954, and then France couldn't hang on to it any longer, so they gave it independence. They did hang on to Vietnam for difficult reasons. They became difficult reasons. Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese used Cambodia as a staging ground and brought in a lot of supplies. The Ho Chi Minh Trail essentially came into Cambodia, then into South Vietnam. The net result is the Americans bombed the hell out of Cambodia. And thousands of Cambodians died. There was a coup in 1970 that put a pro-American government in place. And then that was overturned. And there was essentially a civil war in Cambodia, and which deposed the king through his support behind the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist organization, which got support from Vietnam and China, and the Khmer Rouge won the Civil War and took Phnom Penh in 1975. The Khmer Rouge modeled itself after a Chinese social system and tried to take Cambodia back to the 11th century, to a farming culture. So they emptied the cities. So Phnom Penh, this major city for the length of the Khmer Rouge reign, was essentially deserted. And they forced marched the entire population to rural farming. They tried to eliminate any Western influence. So all the intellectuals, all professionals were essentially murdered. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Killing Fields. That essentially explains what was happening. If you even wore eyeglasses, you're considered intellectual, and you were murdered. It was estimated that 2 million people died as a result of that. That's something like a quarter of the population. And how a country recovers from that, I don't know. But this is what, this is a cyclo, which was a French invention, and that's one way tourists get around the Philippines. The country, the government in place now comes from an attempt at democracy. The UN governed Cambodia for a while in the early 90s, and they set up elections where, and they tried to turn it into a constitutional monarchy. So they reinstated the king, who has no real power, but the present government has been in power, I think, since 1985, and has been not so subtly and not so gradually turning Cambodia into a one-party system. So any political dissent is heavily crushed, and it's becoming a increasingly dictatorship. The population on the whole is not terribly upset with that, because it had such a difficult history recent years, that the stability that creates is not a bad thing for them. But there's great concern in other parts of the world about what's happening. This is the royal palaces in Cambodia, which is a tourist stop. The king doesn't actually live in Cambodia very much. I can't remember where he lives he lived in China for a long time when he was deposed, but he comes for ceremonial visits. But they maintain the palaces in pristine condition, I presume, for tourism.
I understand all those little points on the roofs are supposed to ward off the next
Possibly, or pigeons.
year.
But this is what Cambodia looks like. It's on the whole ancient city. There's more of the wiring that I was talking about, which is characteristic of Southeast Asian cities. It's got this, again, common with a lot of Southeast Asian cities, these very high, narrow buildings, because you can maximize your space on the lot you have by simply going up. There's not much in the way of restrictions on that. It's a very simple architecture, very simple. And again, for 5 years, it was completely abandoned during the Khmer Rouge, and people came back and resettled it. But what's happening, and going back to the demand for power, is it's being developed. And so this is a poster on the waterfront advertising condominium. And everywhere in CMB, you see these huge buildings being built, all out of concrete, which I'll get back to later. So the country is going through some major redevelopment, which again goes back to the demand for hydroelectric power, and changing the landscape considerably. The main mode of transportation still is the motorbike. And so you see them everywhere. And like a lot of cities in the region, navigating the streets is a really interesting challenge. But they do it really well, because there's a system of sort of give and take on the roads, so that you'll I'll show you a picture later on. Here it is here. This is an intersection taken from the balcony of the Foreign Correspondents Club, which is a restaurant. And this is people simply trying to get to this intersection. It's a T-shaped intersection. Main road here, main road come here. No traffic lights, no line markings, no stop signs, but they somehow make it work by simply letting people in, not getting aggressive. No aggression. It's driving as a team sport. It's really interesting, and it strangely works very well. As a pedestrian, the trick is simply to step out and start walking. Keep your constant pace. Don't speed up, don't stop, and traffic will go around you. But it takes a level of courage to do that. Motorbikes are used for everything. There's no end of commercial activities taking place on the back of motorbikes. You can hook a trailer up to them, and that's a particular Cambodian invention. And you can take your whole family on a motorbike. I know only the father has the helmet. Now, the killing fields is a huge part of recent Cambodian history, as I mentioned. One of the things on the tour was a high school, which turned into a prison where all suspected non-revolutionaries were taken and brutally treated. I think of the thousands of people that went through this facility, only 5 survived. And that they were interrogated, tortured in this place, and then taken away and simply murdered in the field. What's staggering about what the Khmer Rouge did is another movie called First They Killed My Father. They utilized children to do a lot of this. But try to break the continuity between parent and child, they turn the children into essentially informants and murderers. So a lot of this work in rounding up people and escorting them were done by 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. And I can't imagine what that does to the psyche of the country after they go through that. What happened in Cambodia is absolutely unbelievable. And this is a little shrine that's been built around bones. This is a monument that's been built at the killing field, which is here. You take a close-up in here, which is these windows, you see some of the skulls that have been collected. Now I took this picture because this was out of outside Cambodia. This is another tour boat, not ours. This is the only example I saw on the entire trip of a recreational craft. I think it's stretching to call it dragon boat, much recreation. But it's also the largest dragon boat I've ever seen. I think I counted 78 people on board. But nowhere else did I see anybody on the river for a good time. Everybody is on the river to earn a living. The concept of a yacht club or a motorboat or a pleasure craft seems to be completely unknown right now. It was actually staggering to see. There are various options on boats. This is obviously a restaurant that's being built, but not very far away are the real people that live on the river. The people doing subsistence fishing and that classic fish boat. There's a general view of the river. The river was quite beautiful. And it's a large river. But you notice how flat the land is, which explains why this flooding thing takes place of the countryside. And gasoline's expensive, so they use it as sparingly as possible, and roller boats. This is one of the larger, more communal fishing activities I saw, involving 6 or 8 men throwing out what I assume was a large drag net. And one part of the tour was a tour of a boat building yard. Because all these thousands of boats you see are built somewhere, and they're all handcrafted. And this is the fellow that runs this yard, and he cuts the wood locally, he heats it and steams it. He He's using a handsaw there, but you do see behind him a electric plane. So it's not all hand work, but he and his family do it. And that's his wife doing the last bit of caulking of the boats. And as I say, you see these boats everywhere. As fish boats for small families. It's supporting fishing on the river. As I said, the number of people whose livelihood depends on fishing in this river is staggering. And one story I heard was after the Vietnam War, which in Vietnam was called, by the way, the American War, was over, Vietnam became a totalitarian communist state, and they instigated economic reforms that were a complete disaster. And so millions of people in Vietnam were starving. So what drove a lot of people to fishing was simply staying alive. And so what we're seeing may be a remnant of that. And these ladies are actually part of the tourist industry now, taking people like us on boat trips in their boats. And the children accompany them everywhere. Now this is something we saw on the lower Mekong. We're in Vietnam now. And we saw a number of these. These are dredges. And what you're doing is dredging the bottom of the river. And this is not for navigational reasons. This is to get sand. And we must have seen 20 or 30 of them in operation. There's 2 more there. And what the sand is valuable for is concrete. So all those high-rise buildings in Phnom Penh, they're all concrete. When you get to Saigon, a lot of construction. Sand is a very, very valuable commodity now. I don't think any of this is regulated. I don't know what the environmental impact of it is, but you'll see it, well, more of it. At the, we're entering a canal here. So we're leaving the Mekong River and entering the Delta. And my recollection of the Mekong is hearing about the Mekong Delta during the Vietnam War. And I'm not sure if scenes in apocalypse now take place in the Mekong Delta or not. But here's the Mekong coming down here, and we're going up here. Hanoi is up here. Not Hanoi, Saigon is up here. And we take at some point, I'm not sure exactly where, take a canal that connects the Mekong with this river here and go on Saigon. And it changes dramatically from small fishing activities to huge commercial activities in a blink of an eye. So suddenly through this canal, you're seeing incredible, unbelievable amount of traffic going both ways. And a lot of that traffic is the sand you saw being dug out of the Mekong River. There's one boat there, and containers going back and forth. This is a major artery. There's a barge full of sand. There's a barge full of sand going one way, and an empty barge, 2 empty barges going the other. That doesn't look like sand. That looks like cut stone, like gravel.
Not much freeboard.
This is a pretty typical tug we saw towing this huge barge, which is empty. And Alan's right, not much freeboard. Those are bricks going one way. And it appears that people live on these boats, because that seems to be the local garden. And there's a tug pushing another big barge full of sand. But that gives you some idea of the amount of traffic we had to deal with on the river. All sorts of shapes and sizes and conditions. And again, a barge full of sand being pushed by this tug. The wheelhouses on these tugs are interesting. It looks like a typical wheelhouse until you realize the scale. That is sort of the height of a person there. So there's no headroom in these wheelhouses. So you look closely, you'll see people inside squatting. And that seemed to be typical. I haven't quite figured out the reasons for that. And then as we get closer to Saigon, it actually turns into navigation boards for the first time. And then we're in Ho Chi Minh City, which is Saigon. And just a few shots of Saigon to end off with. And suddenly you're into a major modern city. And this is something that was true of Phnom Penh as well as Saigon. This lighting the buildings at night seemed to be a huge thing. And you wonder why there's a demand for power. And suddenly you get all this bizarre stuff. And Saigon is undergoing a huge, Saigon is now the economic heart of Vietnam, which is going through a major development. But still lots of remnants of the French colonial days. That's and the Vietnamese are amazing. They were under French rule for 100 years at least. They were under American domination for the Vietnam War, and they don't hold any grudges. They welcome Americans and French as anybody else. I don't know if that's the Buddhist religion, but anybody who would want to hate the United States would be the Vietnamese, and they don't. It is absolutely staggering. That's the Opera House in Saigon. And that's, again, an example of the zoning driving to high-rise, if you want to fully develop your site.
I'll stop then.
But still lots of the old Saigon still there. And the motor scooters everywhere. And it being increasingly influenced by Western culture, you get modern high-rise buildings, and you get Christmas. There is no end of Christmas decorations, and because we were there in November and early December, and we couldn't figure it out. But I don't know if it's aimed at the tourists or it's just an economic thing. But that's the end of the talk. I hope you gave some sense of what cruising down the Mekong is like. And if you have any questions, let me know.
The top gear show that goes down the Mekong in boats? It's on Prime Video. You'd really enjoy it.
What kind of boats are they? This is a Top Gear going down
Top
the
gear.
Mekong in boats?
Yeah, they got 3 different kinds of boats, yeah. But you'd really be interested.
It's on
It's a
YouTube?
different perspective than you gave, but it's still fun. It's well done.
Okay,
It's
I'll
called
look for that.
Seaman or something.
So if I Google Top Gear, Mekong River?
Top Gear, Mekong River, you'll get it.
Okay.
It's on Prime Video.
I'm assuming the lack of sport use of the river is the fact that I'm assuming that the river takes all the sewage from all the houses along it.
That's probably an accurate, the sewage part is probably true, though I think the lack of recreational boating on the river is historic. People just didn't do it. The river was a source of existence. It wasn't a source of fun. These people are just reaping of existence.
They drink the water?
Good question.
They eat the fish.
They eat the fish.
Do you know if North and South Vietnam are one country now, or are they still separated?
They are one country, technically, but they still culturally are different. And the Vietnam War isn't over. I mean, there's still The South, after the war, the South was badly treated by the North. And if you had any connection with the previous government or any connection with the armed forces of the South, you were sent to re-education camps. And our guide, actually, father was a colonel in the ARVN, which is the South Vietnamese army. And he was sent away for 3 years to be re-educated before he was home. So it was, these were virtually concentration camps. And so the South isn't all that happy.
No, it's about how was the mosquitoes?
Didn't see one.
Was that an Australian company, that cruise line you on? Is it, do you know?
Is it what
Is
company?
it an Australian company?
Australian?
Yeah, you
I don't know. There were Australians on board. The passengers consisted of Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians. It was an entirely English-speaking boat.
Were you advised to get malaria shots and whatnot before you went?
Yes.
But no mosquitoes?
I don't remember mosquitoes or bugs
Was that
at all
just
being
because
an
you were
issue.
on the water most of the time with the breeze flowing, or
Yeah.
was it?
Can't explain it.
Ron,
Paul?
I've always been confused by the Algonquin Island Mafia and the Queen City Yacht Club.
One and the same, Paul. One and the same.
Because Al Ray's father, just Al Ray here, was Tom Laren sailor, very good, and Bazaar Man, who was the head of Shellbacks. But your father, who I hear produced you and your brother, was
My mother claims that.
Yeah, was the most feared fastball pitcher in this area.
Here, here.
He was an outstanding baseball player, and I just never understood why you guys became sailors when he was such a great baseball player.
Well, it's actually funny you mention that, because we did play baseball as 12-year-olds, and there's an island baseball team, and my brother was a pitcher. And here is my brother, a pitcher at age 13, with a father who was probably the best fastball pitcher in the city of Toronto in his heyday. And Dad, being a father of his era, didn't teach my brother anything.
I was an OCBC.
It was an era when the parents seemed to be completely disinterested in what the kids are doing. And I'm not sure that's not a bad thing. Alan?
Yeah, but your dad was a hell of a good sailor too.
Well, by then he was a sailor. That's how we got involved with sailing. And he rose to the height of power in the Queen City Yacht Club, which was not commodore. It was bar captain.
Yes.
Should have been an art club too.
So thank you all. Hope that gave you some insight, but it was fun doing it.
Thank you so much, Ron. It took me back to the cruise that I took in Malaysia. Those wires were everywhere, and I could not understand because they were just like a spaghetti mess.
Yes.
Just a mess. But thank you for bringing us a little bit of the other part of the world that we don't see very often. Your pictures were wonderful, and the research you did on the history was excellent. So, with a small token of our appreciation, let's give Ron just another big round of applause. And coming up next week, we have Boundless, sailing from Bedeck, Nova Scotia to a rescue at sea. Neil Hetherington will share the harrowing tale of a rogue wave, a lost 38-foot vessel, a mayday heard by Captain Wendell Hendricks of the Ardmore Sealifter, who then navigated the 700-foot oil tanker to rescue the captain and crew. And following that, Sally and Noel Leon will, they recently sailed the English Channel to visit the south coast of England and also took a side trip to Turkey. So they will inimitably share their impressions and thoughts about their journey. And with that, pipes out.
Thank you, Skipper.
Thank you.